Hello, my name is Kyle Weddington, and I would like to welcome everyone to today's webinar. Webinars are brought to you as a membership benefit of Heritage Ohio. Heritage Ohio's mission is to help people to save the places that matter, build community, and live better. Today, we will have a presentation on how autonomous cars will reshape our cities. We will be taking questions at the end of the presentation. If you have a question, please type it into the question box at any time. Most issues with the webinar software will be solved if you close the program and restart it with the link that was sent to you. Our presenters today are Justin Robbins and Rick Stein. If you guys both want to introduce yourself.
Be more than happy to. My name is Justin Robbins. I'm a senior planner at OHM Advisors. We're a multidisciplinary architecture, engineering, planning firm out of Columbus, Ohio. Been a planner for about 5 years and a background in architecture before that.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Rick Stein. I am the founder and principal of a planning firm in Columbus called Urban Decision Group. We are a very small firm. We specialize in technology and data analysis as it pertains to the planning and development communities. And I am the token data nerd of our research team.
So this is Justin speaking, and just to be clear, there is a third member of our group who unfortunately could not make it today, and that is Jason Sudi. He is the founder of Side Street Planning, but he has actually come to work for OHM Advisors and will be starting full-time come January. So just to give everybody a little bit of a background on kind of the thought process that we've had and how we got started on this track, set the stage for about a year ago, and Jason and Rick and I were at a conference, a planning conference up in Toledo, and the mayor of Pittsburgh was giving a presentation, the ex-mayor, and had mentioned how technology can change and have very massive effects, disruptive effects on how our cities function. And he had mentioned autonomous cars as one of those technologies that's really on the forefront of being developed. And as Jason always says, it was kind of like British Parliament. There was a lot of harumphing in the room, and basically there was a sense among our profession that it was far off and wouldn't have some of these large disruptive effects. And we kind of looked at each other and thought, hey, this is our chance to really start to communicate to our fellow planners and to the communities that we work with that this is going to be coming. It's going to be coming quick, and it's going to be really important to get ahead of it and to understand what the impacts will be.
And so it was at that point a year ago that we started doing our research, and we weren't sure where the research was going to take us. And we started putting together, I started putting together some computational models to try to anticipate where the fastest growth would occur, the fastest adoption rates, and some of the models, ownership versus shared models that would manifest themselves. And our original estimates we found them to be much too conservative. In just a little over a year, a lot of the things that we thought would develop within a 5-year time period are actually in use today. So that's to give you some idea of how quickly the landscape is changing.
One of the interesting parts of technology is how quickly it grows. And I'll get into that a little bit more in the presentation, but the things that we want to cover today, and we're going to try and be as succinct as possible. We're going to try and keep this around 45 minutes and open up enough time for questions. But what do we want to get out today? Well, we want you to have an understanding of what the next few years is going to bring with the technology. We want to talk about how we can start to prepare for that future, and we want to basically spread the message that we have to start thinking about this now. It's really important because this is going to happen very, very quickly, and we're basically looking at a tidal wave coming toward us and not really understanding what those effects are going to be.
No, and the nature of planning the development is, we make plans that are mid to long range in nature, and we build things that hopefully last over 100 years. And if that's the case, then getting out in front of it is really important, because this is going to happen sooner than you think.
So one of my favorite parts of the presentation, we always start with a word from the experts, and this is just to kind of level the playing field and make sure that people understand that what seems impossible today is extremely possible and almost likely the next day. So on electricity, when the Paris exhibition of 1878 closes, electric light will close with it, and no more of it will be heard. Of course, Oxford professor Erasmus Wilson. On trains, what can be more absurd than the prospect held out of locomotives traveling twice as fast as stagecoaches? Quarterly Review, 1825. And absolutely my favorite on cars. The horse is here to stay, but the automobile is only a novelty, a fad. And as everybody could see, that's the president of the Michigan Savings Bank advising Henry Ford's lawyer not to invest in the Ford Motor Company in 1903. As all of you know, history has shown him to be incorrect. But it's very easy for people to get stuck and look at all of the hurdles in terms of what needs to be done in order to get certain technologies running. But those tend to get figured out. And when you look at the sea change that happens when these technologies occur, it's something we have to really start thinking about. So we're going to talk a little bit, and this is the part of our presentation that we've shortened a lot. So when we first started going around to the conferences and the planning world, half of our presentation was really driving home that this was going to happen. I think there's enough instance in the world today that we can point to show you that it's really trending very, very quickly. So we got to shorten this part of our presentation quite a bit. But just to go over some of these numbers here, we're seeing a big change in how people are actually using cars. And if you look at over the course of, let's say, 10 years, we're looking at a pretty serious drop in the number of drivers in terms of 16-year-olds that are getting their license. So we see a lot in the millennial generation and the younger generations as well that having a car and driving is not necessarily the be-all, end-all. So you're really setting the stage for adoption of a technology that doesn't fulfill the great American dream.
And what you don't see in that infographic is in 2015, for the first time since we started keeping records, there are more 16-year-olds without their driver's licenses than with their driver's licenses.
A crazy stat. Part of what we talk about as well is how quickly technologies adopt, and they tend to do so on an exponential curve. And the graph that we have here is U.S. smartphone adoption within roughly from the introduction of the iPhone. And you can see that on the graph in April of 2007 up until January of 2015. And we see a curve within less than a 10-year period of more than 75 to 80% of the people adopting cell phones. That's an enormous adoption of a technology within a very short span of time. And if you think back, and I'm sure all of you have your smartphones out right now, look at the smartphone that you have in front of you. If you think back 10 years, what did that look like? That was a flip phone. That was a flip phone that had kind of a grainy green screen. It might have played some 8-bit music, and now you can access all the world's data from a little portal that you can carry around everywhere.
When you think of the factors that are driving this exponential adoption, it's price, and then it's convenience, and then there's also a little bit of peer pressure baked into that too, because nobody wants to be caught holding a flip phone anymore. But primarily it's driven by price. So, I mean, you can go out there and get yourself a smartphone for less than $100 with a fairly reasonable data plan today, and have really more of the computing power that was available in the first iPhone. And remember, the first iPhone came out in 2007. We're only 9 years removed from that.
To take a look at the technology and who's investing in it now, you look at the number of logos that we have up there, and you'll notice that these are some big companies, and they are investing enormous sums of money, tremendous sums of money, in being the first and the most effective adopter of the technology. So as you can see, we have, in terms of technology companies, Apple, Uber, Google, Tesla. These are basically the forefront of what's going on right now, and you can see some of the other ones: Ford, GM, BMW, Audi. I mean, everybody understands that this is the future, and they are piling on as much research capabilities as possible to make sure that they are not left behind in that sense.
And what's interesting about that is who's driving the bus. Technology companies have always invested in car companies, but in this case, it's the technology companies themselves that are actually driving this forward, and then the car companies are partnering up with the technology companies.
We take a look forward, and we have current implementation. So this is the part of the presentation that we cut a lot of information out, but we want to show you on-the-ground examples of where this is right now. And we have 3 different examples. We have Greece, and this is almost a quasi-public transportation model, which I'm sure some of the questions will focus on public transportation as well, which we'd be more than happy to talk about. Dubai, they want to have, I think, 30% of their traffic be fully autonomous by the year 2025, and you can see Singapore. I mean, this is an adoption model that's a little bit unusual, but part of what we need to do is stop thinking about autonomous cars as a car like you know it today, where you just don't steer. we're talking about a different transportation form than we've really seen in the past. And to the extent that we can plan for that, it's going to be very difficult, but it's going to have, again, a lot of those impacts. Now, the models that we have here, these are all 10-passenger, 5-passenger shuttles. And if you are trying to supplement public transportation, I mean, you could have a system where one of these comes by every 5 minutes. And you're talking about public transportation that's a lot more robust and a lot more effective than a lot of the models we have out today.
My favorite picture on this screen, though, is the one in the bottom right-hand corner, because it's actually showing you an example of how building design has changed to accommodate a driverless car. And keep that in mind as you listen and see the rest of this presentation, that it's more than just transportation. It's, in fact, transportation is just a drop in the bucket. It's secondary. Everything else.
Some of the more publicized that we've seen, so Google right now has what we call a level 4 or level 5 car on the road. That's the one on the top left. We go to the bottom left. This is the Tesla. Tesla has just announced that all the cars they're going to be selling from basically this moment forward, we're going to have the capabilities to be fully autonomous. They have the ability to upgrade their software over the air instantaneously. So what we're really talking about is the sensors are built in, the control modules are built in. It's just an upgrade of what the car's algorithms and computer capabilities are. The most exciting one that we have is on the right-hand side, and this is a Ford Fusion. This is a joint venture with, well, I should say it's Uber, fully in operation right now, and we're going to have a video that shows these actually running. This is in Pittsburgh. So at the moment, they have, I believe, up to 25 cars in their regular rotation that are fully autonomous. The driver in the front seat is an engineer. He's just recording to see what this thing does. But you can go right now down to Pittsburgh and you can call up an Uber app and you can potentially get one of these cars if you're in the right area and if you're lucky. They're looking in the next year to hopefully have, I think, might be up to 100 cars on the road. And their whole goal is to test this in Pittsburgh. Now, Pittsburgh, for anybody who's ever been there and driven there, is an extraordinarily challenging driving environment. You have a lot of bridges. You have, I think, 700 bridges within the city. You have substantial change in grade. You have different materials that the car has to drive over. So if one of these things can master Pittsburgh, it can pretty much master almost anywhere else in the U.S. And here's a video. Is that not working? So we're told that the video might not be communicating as well as possible. So we'll let it play for just a moment for anybody who is having luck with it. But you can see the cars in operation in Pittsburgh right now. And what the crux of the video is people really giving their opinions. And you can see one of these things in action in Pittsburgh. So I'll go ahead and stop the video just so nobody has to sit through if it's not working properly. We have two more that we'll go ahead and skip over. The next one, it'll be there's something that's going on the freight side, and that's called truck platooning. And the video describes that, but since I'm skipping over, I'll go ahead and take a stab at it. It's basically, if you imagine a professional driver in a front truck, and then you have, let's say, a train of trucks behind you. You could have 3 to 4 trucks, each one following, let's say, 6 to 12 inches off the bumper of the previous one. Any change that the driver has, the other trucks are going to know instantaneously, so they can react accordingly. So it's going to be something that I think all estimates see this on the road within 5 years.
Well, as we sit, we are here in Columbus, and as some of you may know, Columbus was awarded a Smart Cities grant recently this year, which for all intents and purposes just means the feds have outlined, they've identified a few projects that they want to focus on, and those federal funds are being matched with private investments, and one of those projects are the implementation of truck platoons, primarily running from Rickenbacker Airport up to, I believe it's the Limited. Yep. This is the first test run. But we will start seeing those as early as next year here in Columbus.
When we start talking about the impacts, assume a situation where we have one professional driver and one truck following behind. If we assume that we're moving the same amount of cargo, you basically need half the amount of drivers. So anybody considering a career in trucking, I might want to persuade you to think elsewhere at the moment. So these are the scale of changes that we're going to talk about. And I think this is it's scary, and we don't have all the answers. We don't know everything, but I think in terms of how cities function, there's going to be a lot of opportunity there. So some of the common objections that we've heard so far. People tend to love their cars. They love driving too much. Well, this is how people think that they drive. In reality, that's not necessarily the case. Usually you're stuck in traffic and not having too much of a good time. But I can tell you that there's other things that people tend to love more, and you can see there's other people standing in line on their cell phones. And if you've ever driven in the past 5 years, you know that most people aren't really actually driving. They're just playing on their cell phone. So this technology really fits in pretty well with the way our lifestyles are going. Another thing to bring up is the notion of safety. And we have some numbers thrown up on the screen right now. And these numbers are 2013. Some of the ones that I want to point out are fatal crashes per year in the U.S., the very bottom line. 32,000. Right now, we're on track for almost 40,000.
40,000 this year.
This year. That's primarily that's not an increase necessarily in drunk driving, but that's an increase in distracted driving. So the picture I showed of the folks on their cell phone, these are the ones that are causing a lot of the fatalities. Of the GDP, you're looking at about 2% of our GDP that's really right now going towards automotive accidents and property damage. The number that corresponds to that is the percentage of human cause as the primary factor at 93%. What that means is if you have a technology that can bring that percentage down substantially, we're looking at an enormous amount of lives saved. And one of the objections that we have is in terms of safety. What if these things get hacked? What if there's a glitch? What if the cars run themselves off a cliff? Like, well, yeah, that could happen. When we're looking at 40,000 deaths within a country by one mode of transportation per year, let's say as a thought experiment, somebody gets a hold of 1,000 cars and runs them all off the cliff. 1,000 people, let's say, die.
It's a doomsday scenario.
A doomsday scenario, but even still, it's still orders and orders of magnitude safer than our current situation. So, we trust technology more than we think we do. My guess is 15 years ago, if you would have asked anybody if they were going to do banking on their cell phone, they would say absolutely not. I did it this morning. So it's a matter of being more comfortable with the technology and understanding how it functions. And then once that happens, people will be a lot more able and apt to adopt. Well, how's this going to work? This is another section that we, I would say, went a little easy on for this webinar. What we have here are the 5 levels of automation. I'll let Rick talk a little more about this if you'd like.
So the auto industry likes to categorize vehicles by the level of technology that is implemented in the vehicles. And so they've come up with this scale to better consolidate what those technologies are. And if you look at level 2, which is partial automation, that's by and large, that's where we are right now. If you were to go out and purchase a new car, there's a very good chance that that car will come standard with some of these level 2, and then some of these level 2 technologies will be add-ons. Things like adaptive cruise control, for example. That's when your car basically takes over and brakes or speeds up depending on the threats that it determines are around it. But one thing I want to point out is historically there are a lot of new technologies that are considered elective when you purchase a car that are now absolutely standard. Anti-lock brakes, for example, that used to be an add-on. Well, now it comes standard. Airbags at one point were an add-on. Seatbelts way back when were an add-on. But as we go through the scale, the holy grail is full automation. That's a level 5. That's a car, I use car with air quotes, that has no steering wheel. You get in it, you tell it where you want it to go. You can actually tell it an entire trip or tell it turn by turn where you want it to go. Or they anticipate that you could use hand gestures on something like a tablet to maneuver it, if anticipate where the stops are.
I think what's important for level 5 is the idea that these cars will have situational awareness. They'll be able to monitor their environment. They'll be able to understand through the network exactly where traffic demand is coming from and going to, and be able to react accordingly. So a situation in which every single car on the road becomes a sensor. Every single car on the road can sense the outside world and really know what's going on all the city streets, re-network cars if they have to, and make the system basically optimized in such a way that we haven't seen. And I will say, if anybody else has noticed, on level 5, it's basically all driving tasks are taken away from the driver. There's really nothing left that they can do. Here's an example, and I mentioned this as well. We have 2 different ways that these communicate. We have V2V, which is vehicle to vehicle, and then V2I, vehicle to infrastructure. The cars that we have on the roads right now use a combination of both. I know the Smart Cities application and grant will focus heavily on the V2I. So actually implementing the infrastructure in terms of how it communicates with on-the-ground sensors and understanding its environment. My guess is in the future this will be less and less necessary as vehicle to vehicle becomes a little more standard. You're not necessarily going to have a lot of infrastructure that's built in place to actually accommodate cars like this.
Yeah, based on the research that we've done and the experts that we've spoken to over the past year plus, it's the vehicle-to-vehicle technology that is, once that becomes standard, that's really the thing that propels this into hyperdrive. I mean, we're already moving very fast with a lot of these other technologies, but once cars are aware to react to other cars and anticipate their movements, changes in speed, their routes, that's when things really start to click. So, the infrastructure today, we have speed limits and we have to maneuver traffic based on the speed limits and the existing volume of cars. So in this vehicle-to-vehicle world, though, conceivably your speed limits could be lower, but yet you could still arrive at your destination faster because there wouldn't be a need for stopping at every single stop sign and stoplight. And really from the pedestrian's point of view, in theory, you wouldn't need something like crosswalks. Again, this is theoretical, but you would literally be able to walk out in front of traffic and traffic should respond to you there and slow down and stop altogether and wait for you to go.
Should do that right now. So just to keep moving, we have a video. I'll let it play for a second if it goes. This is done by MIT, and this just shows 2 different intersections. If anybody can see it, there's basically a stream of traffic coming at a 90-degree angle, and at our current infrastructure, all those vehicles have to stop. If you have automated, fully networked, optimized intersection, then basically the spacing of those vehicles from one to the other can allow another vehicle to shoot past at the same speed. So you could have 2 streams of traffic that basically go perpendicular to each other and don't have to stop or slow down. As we play these videos, these are things that we can actually provide via YouTube so everybody can see, because I think this one's pretty compelling and pretty important. And we'll try and... As we move forward, this is a slide that Ben Pierce from Battelle, and I think he works for HDR now, had created. But this shows the relative cost of the technology as it's occurred over the year. And you'll notice it's an inverse of an exponential curve. So every year it comes down by a pretty substantial amount. And you can see that by the year 2020, we're looking at high-end vehicle fleets that can basically front the cost of the autonomous technology. By 2026, non-luxury fleets. And as you go further in time, the cost less and less and less. And that's really going to be the driver of what happens. Really going to be the driver of how quickly this gets picked up, because as everybody knows, as things become cheaper, eventually it's going to be easy to make that decision. So I have a 2004 Honda Element. When that thing needs a new transmission and it's going to cost $3,000, if I have to do the math in my head and I can say, hey, maybe I can just get rid of the car altogether and rely on a service for basically the same amount per year, there's no need to actually have a car that you own anymore. Oops. Okay. What we need to talk about is the idea of this technology as mobility and not machines. That's not something that we coined, but It's a really important concept to understand. What makes this incredibly powerful is the idea that you would buy transportation and not the machine. Why is that important? Well, basically it does away with parking lots. It does away with the need for parking lots and tying development to those parking lots. And that's really what our focus is on, and trying to understand how that relationship occurs for cities like Columbus, or like a lot of the historic downtowns that we have throughout Ohio. In a perfect world, in a perfect situation, you have companies, I shouldn't say perfect, but in a situation where you want to eliminate parking altogether, you're going to have service companies such as Uber, Google, Tesla, that can basically charge you per mile and can share the cost of that ride with anybody else that's on the network and going to the same place you are.
So that's an example of what we call the shared model. And so it is really not significantly different than summoning an Uber or a Lyft today. The difference being, we think will respond much quicker, like within a matter of seconds, less than 30 seconds, and there won't be a driver. But we also believe that there's going to be room for pure ownership models, similar to what you probably familiar with right now. You've got a household, you may have 1 or 2 cars in your household. We still think there's a certain segment of the population that will want to maintain ownership. Further, we think the implications for public transportation are significant. So we see the implementation of this technology throughout the public transportation infrastructure, and you can imagine what that allows transportation providers to deploy. What does that mean? Does that mean we are moving to fleets of much smaller buses? I believe that's quite possible. Individual transportation managed by a public transportation authority, that's a possibility too. Right now, transportation authorities are effectively competing against the private sector. It's just a matter of cost and ease. But we really, and I'll get into this in more detail later, there's another adoption model, and that is somewhat of a hybrid, where maybe 1-car households eliminate car ownership altogether, and 2-car households go to a single-car ownership model, and they supplement that with a shared service model.
So just to get your appetites wet, this is a concept car that Mercedes put out, and you can see that there is a steering wheel at the back right corner of the image, but you can also see that there isn't necessarily the need for somebody to man it. So you could have a situation where you have 4 people in the car and you're able to hold a conversation, drink a beer, do all the things that you really can't do while you're driving right now. So personally, I'm excited because my ride to and from work could be a bit more enjoyable than paying attention to traffic. But again, this has, it's really the effects of this that's what's important. And here's another one. This is a individual transport. We're just trying to get people to think that it's not necessarily a set model that we're looking at. The future that we envision right now could be completely different than what actually happens 10 years from now. But I think what's important is that we have the flexibility to really build off of what the technological change is going to be.
And keep in mind, cars are designed and roads and infrastructure are designed around the human element. So the limitations placed on our built environment and our transportation infrastructure, those are functions of the limitations of humans and the cars within the humans. So, think about turning radiuses and parking garages and parking lots and the space and size of those stalls for those cars. They're there so you can open up your door and have enough room to get out of the car. Well, what if your car just goes and parks itself, in a parking space? You could probably squeeze about 40% more vehicles into the standard parking lot.
Just to give a sense of how some of these technology entrepreneurs view the coming, I'll say, tidal wave, John Zimmer, co-founder of Lyft, was quoted in Time magazine, "Car ownership will all but end in major U.S. cities in less than 10 years. This is an on-the-ground company that's looking to do this." And then we have our very own Elon Musk. I shouldn't say very own as if we have anything to do with him, but half of all cars produced in 7 or 8 years will be fully autonomous. That's a staggering number. So you're talking about a market that's really going to open up in a very short amount of time. We have to start planning for it now. So to take a step back and talk a little bit about the history of city development, and this is really important for historic downtowns. And what we've seen over the past 70 years is the introduction of the automobile. So basically throughout all of human civilization, the history of civilization, city development has progressed pretty slowly and incrementally. Different cultures have different ways of accommodating how their city development occurs, but in general, buildings align along the street, they're compact. That was all blown apart once we introduced the automobile, and we've completely changed the game for how development in cities get built within this country and with a lot of the other developed countries around the world. This is in, I believe, 1950 or shortly thereafter. You can see that this does not look like any type of city that we've seen prior to this. This is something that is a completely new model. As quickly as the car came, we changed how development occurs in this country. Taken to its logical extent, we have massive amounts of suburbs that are built drawing people out of the central city. And then we have the ultimate end-all be-all site development, auto-dominated sites. What's interesting about this is you take a look at the actual square footage of this building and you look at all the land it takes to support that. So the only thing that's actually generating revenue and producing a sense of place, if you can call it that, is the square footage in that building. The rest of it is basically wasted. And that's what we're talking about, is recapturing a lot of the value that we lost in terms of accommodating automobiles. Now, historic downtowns, we work in a lot of historic downtowns all around Ohio. And the number one thing that I hear when I walk into the door is people complaining about parking. Well, we don't have enough parking. Well, that's not necessarily going to be so much of an issue anymore, because there's going to be a lot of other options that are available for people to actually access these places. My guess is 10, 15, 20 years from now, it's going to be the historic downtowns that are really the places that people want to go. They're going to be a lot more easily accessible than they are now because you don't have to accommodate parking. And they'll make room for a lot more development because you don't have to balance that out. We'll talk a little bit more about that throughout the presentation. Basically, we're nearing the end of an almost 70-year experiment with the new one about to begin. We're completely turning the tables on how we as a society view development. A lot of that has come at the detriment of historic downtowns, and I think the time has come, or the time will be coming, that we can start to rebuild a lot of what we've lost. How will this impact everything? I'm just going to throw this up for a second. We're aware of all these items, and there's probably a million more that we're not even thinking about. There's going to be entire industries that are completely turned on their heads. Trucking, auto insurance, medicine, all the things that rely on how our world functions right now, they're basically going to have the rug pulled out from underneath them. Not everything might be affected, but again, it's something that's going to have some pretty tremendous effects on our entire economy. So what we're really focused on is the built environment in the city. When and how fast? Rick, I'll let you
sure.
take us through.
So several months ago, Justin had mentioned that we had been on the lecture circuit talking to planners and architects and developers and kind of sounding the alarm that this is getting ready to happen when we need to prepare. So I believe this was in June, we spoke at the Central Ohio Planning and Zoning seminar, and we built a series of models to illustrate what we anticipated was going to happen in Central Ohio. So this is the study area that we were looking at when we were doing this exercise. So we pulled together some data, and we used a geographic information system along with some models that I had built and some analytical tools that I had built. And we took into account things like land parcel data and land use, the existing transportation infrastructure and some of the usage characteristics, data on commuting characteristics, housing, location of business and services and the intensity of those businesses, and then the standard population by age and density, along with the income characteristics of that population. And so we created a model to illustrate the readiness for adoption. So it used as input all those variables I mentioned, and really that was just kind of skimming the surface. So of those data points, there were about 700 different subsets of data that we took into account. Some were more meaningful than others, and we used statistical techniques like regression to determine what was more pertinent to, we wanted to establish the cause and effect relationships of those variables. And so we computed what we're calling a readiness index. And that's just a way to visually illustrate, okay, here is geographically the areas that right now we believe are most likely to adopt this technology with little immediate change in the infrastructure and the built environment. And as predictably, you can see it's the core of the central city in Columbus that is most ready. The least ready are the rural locations. Wait a minute. So when we dive down to the micro level, we can determine which neighborhoods in Central Ohio were the most ready. And what we found was the Wyland Park neighborhood, which is east of Ohio State, Victorian Village, the university itself, and German Village. And I think of particular interest to this audience is these are by and large historic neighborhoods. So it's the historic neighborhoods that are ironically the most ready to adopt this cutting edge technology. But I was fascinated with which models are likely to be adopted. So I put together some data to try to determine, okay, which one's going to dominate? Is it the ownership model or is it the shared model? And so this first map illustration is the adoption of the shared model. And one thing to take away from it is it's rather pervasive. The shared model is, by and large, it's most popular in your urban cores or your cities with any density at all. But no one is untouched in this. And here's the ownership model, which is even more pervasive because there's more rural territory than there is urban territory in this particular exercise. And it makes sense. I can anticipate that the shared model would be adopted by cities much quicker because of the density requirements and things like housing tenure. That's owners and renters. You just have a built-in population ready to handle this stuff. In rural environments, and as someone that grew up in a rural environment, you basically need a car to go anywhere. And at least at the outset, where are the services going to locate? Well, they're going to locate where the most people are initially. That said, eventually, just like cell phone adoption, you keep striving for more and more market share. So as your market share requirements increase, you're going to have to seek out who that population is, and eventually that population will make it. We will make it into the more rural environments.
I think what's important to take from it is in the next 10 years, you're going to have two choices. You can either follow where the technology is going to take you, or you can determine how the technology is going to serve you. And I think that's one of the things that we really want to relate to this crowd is that, again, this is an opportunity. This is an opportunity to make the most of what we see within our historic downtowns and how to actually use the technology to make sure that we're not raising buildings in order to build parking, that we're not investing enormous sums of money to build parking structures that might be obsolete in 20 years. There's a lot of kind of trickle-down effects that are going to happen, and we need to be aware of it. Part of what we need to do as well is to just open up the conversation. So as I mentioned, I'm a consultant planner. When I go around to communities, if I walked into a steering committee meeting and mentioned, maybe we don't want to address parking right now because of autonomous cars, I'd probably get laughed out. Not to say it's not an important conversation to have, but even then, it's nice to have, hopefully, a basis of understanding from the entire planning or Heritage Ohio community that, look, the problems that we have today, the technology that's coming online in the next few years might make those completely obsolete. So what are the impacts? I'm going to go over, and at the planning conference, I had fun with the fellow planners because there was a lot that they weren't aware of. These are just some basic numbers that are kind of bedrocks of development. So what's the average size of a parking space? We're looking at anywhere from 9 by 18 to 10 to 20. So you're looking at plus to minus 200 square feet. How many parking spaces can you get per acre of land? A really fun question. So you can get about 100 spaces per acre, and that's efficiently designed parking that includes tree islands and all the good stuff that you would need. How many parking spaces would you need for 1,000 square feet of retail? So the 1,000 square feet, just to be clear, is the part that's actually making money. So current zoning within most municipalities, you're looking at 3 to 4 parking spaces, or if you remember our previous calculations, 1,700 square feet of land. So this is an important slide. This is what I really need to drive home is our current development pattern right now. If you want to develop 1,000 square feet of building, that's 1,000 square feet that's actually producing taxable value, that's adding to a sense of place, you need an additional 1,700 square feet of land that's used for car storage. It's an enormous amount. That's heavily skewed in favor of car storage.
It's almost twice the size of the building itself.
What's crazy about that is cities and municipalities now have to run infrastructure. They have to provide roadway past that 1,700 square feet. They have to provide water lines past all that. So again, it's really skewing our entire development pattern to provide for parking. Well, what's parking? Parking is really just transportation. It's getting from one place to the other. The problem is our current model, the cars don't drive themselves. It's not really a problem, but it's where we're at right now. If I drive from my house to a store, the car gets left there. Again, there has to be space provided for me to even enter the store and for them to make money. One of the staggering statistics that I heard within a city like Columbus, this was done by ULI, that for every car on the road, there are 3 parking spaces that exist to accommodate it. So if you can imagine, just within this room, we have 5 people in this room. Each of you, I assume, owns a car. We're looking at 15 parking spaces that exist within the city just to provide storage for those. So we're talking about an enormous amount of land,
Not to mention that your home or apartment building is providing the same parking too. So you're paying for storage of something that, as part of, let's see, if you're a homeowner, as part of your mortgage, maybe 10% of your mortgage, 5% of your mortgage is actually attributed to storing your car. And the numbers state that your car on average in a day is idle 95% of the time at a minimum. I mean, unless you're a cross-country truck driver or you do sales
Uber
for
driver.
a living, yeah, you're usually not driving.
So to carry it back, this was the one question that I would say a majority of the planners got right. How many square feet an acre? Everybody knows 43,560 square feet.
Everybody knows that.
Given 1 acre of land, how much retail can you develop? So out of that 43,000, you're going to get roughly 10,000 square feet. As everybody can see, these numbers don't match up. Now, this is where historic downtowns really excel because you have a development pattern that wasn't designed around cars. The problem is we've tried to basically implement these numbers into historic downtowns to accommodate cars, and it's been a really big problem. We've destroyed a lot of historic buildings. We've ruined a lot of the character of these places, but I think now is a really good opportunity to rethink how we actually go about saving those places and making sure that they are vibrant. Well, what's the message? Right now, parking is the #1 constraint for development in almost any context. What I mean by that is it can be the strip mall by the freeway, or it can be the historic downtown. Even if there's buildings that exist, you might have trouble actually attracting tenants because, again, they're going to say, hey, there's no parking. So what we did is we took a look at a couple areas just to try and understand the scale of what was happening. These are 2 areas around Columbus, and we tried to keep the site around 100 acres. So this is within the city of Columbus. It's on Hilliard Rome Road, I-70. But if you look within the red line, that could be almost anywhere. That could be anywhere USA. Everybody's familiar with the development pattern. I think we have a Walmart on the left. There's, I think, a Meijer on the right, probably a Home Depot tucked in there somewhere, some strip retail, and then out parcels. So we really wanted to understand how much of this land is taken up by the different elements that are required to actually have a functioning site. So to start, green space and circulation makes up about 20% of that site. So you're looking at about 23 acres. That's the area highlighted in pink right there. We take it a little bit further and we have streets and access make up about 22% of the site. When it comes to building area, we have 15% of the site. And that's the lowest number that I'm going to throw up there is building area. And you're getting 750,000 square feet of building area out of that approximately 109 acres. When we get to parking, we're looking at 40% of our site, our test site, is being taken up by parking. What's interesting about that is that's 40% that is now going to be open for development, but it's development unlike we are used to as a society right now. That is now development that is unconstrained by parking. So previously, if I were to walk up to a developer and said, hey, I have 44,000 acres I can sell you right now. What can you build on? And he'd say, well, I can build basically 40,000 square feet of retail. Well, that doesn't matter anymore. Once you eliminate parking, he can build or she can build really as much as they want. So it's really taking that constraint of parking out of the equation for the development community. So right now, that 44 acres, that can be 1 million square feet of retail. It can be 1,000 units of housing. It can be really anything to any density that you want. The second site that we looked at was in the context of this is downtown Columbus. This is 104 acres just to the north of I-70. It's actually not too far from where we're broadcasting from right now. I think we can probably see it out the window. We take a look at how much is actually used by green space and circulation. My PowerPoint will catch up. Bear with me here. Okay, we're at about 25% of that site that's used for green space and circulation. When we include the streets and access, you're at 18%. This is all the public space that's required to actually access these sites. When we get to building area, that's not too far off the 15% that we saw from the I don't want to say Hilliard model, but the model out by Hilliard. The main difference is you'll see there's 2 million square feet of building area versus the 750,000 square feet of building area. And one thing I want to point out is within this district, this is the CPD district within Columbus, there are no parking requirements within this district. So you can basically open up a business in any building. You can build to any density that you want. There's no requirements for how you have to actually provide parking. But you'll notice that it's almost reached an equilibrium. So people stop developing because there's no way to accommodate all the folks who want to come and access the site. The last number, again, parking, 40%. So you can see 2 very different development scenarios have roughly the same breakdown of uses within those areas, developed in totally different manners, in different time periods. But you can see that once you start accommodating for cars, and my guess is if we did this for a lot of the other communities, probably on this webinar right now, these numbers would break out to be very similar to what you have in your historic downtowns. Which brings us to the question of garages. This is a plan that was done by another planning firm in Columbus. It was a pretty good plan. This is the area that I've outlined in that 104 acres, and those areas in red are potential areas for parking garages. Now, for anybody unaware and unfamiliar, a parking garage and a parking space, what you're looking at when you take account for the construction of a parking space is about $3,000 to $4,000 per parking space for a new lot. When you jump up to a garage, you're looking at anywhere from $18,000 to $30,000 per parking space. So you can see that to get an additional 1,000 square feet, or let's say 300 square feet if you're doing retail, you have to provide a parking space that could cost you an upwards of $30,000. That math doesn't necessarily make sense. Again, this provides a little bit of a problem for cities who have started bonding garages, because you have a garage that might have been bonded for 30 years. All of a sudden, the revenue that you're expecting over the course of that 30 years might go down significantly. My recommendation to anybody considering building a parking garage would be to consider its potential reuse once parking is no longer necessarily a requirement. So we're talking about a floor-to-ceiling height that can accommodate residential or retail. We're talking about floor plates that aren't necessarily done in a helix fashion. The helix is what you see here in this garage, and this is across the street from the convention center downtown. But a helix garage makes it very, very difficult to reuse that garage for another use. So you might have to go to a less efficient garage, but it's something that you could potentially reuse in the future. And then there's different reuses that we might not even be considering. So this garage could have a reuse as, let's say, a charging hive, so the vehicles could come and go out of this garage and then really act to, charge and reorient themselves to provide services throughout the day. But again, we've talked to a number of developers around the city, and a lot of them regard parking garages to be one of the most riskiest real estate transactions or propositions that you could have right now, because the future for them is uncertain. So I would really want to communicate that to a lot of the communities that might be listening right now. What are the key points? Well, parking, again, is the major constraint on development. Future development is going to be free from parking constraints, or mostly free. The old rules of development will be obsolete. Everything is going to change. Every developer that we know outside of, let's say, New York City or probably San Francisco is going to have to rethink how development occurs and what those land values and those prices are. An enormous increase in developable land, but you're going to have some side effects with that. You might have a change in the cost of land within your city. If you dump 40% of your land onto an open market that is now developable to any extent, you're going to have some pretty big changes in how that land is valued. Again, urban areas now have the ability to become denser, but in the same token, suburban areas have the ability to expand. You're taking the cost away from actually accessing those less dense areas. So I mentioned that Mercedes car that I would like to drive in, not facing the driving or the steering wheel, driving now to Delaware or wherever in the outskirts of the metropolitan areas might not be such a chore, because you can sit back, you can read a book, you can get work done, you can get a walk in there and cook food. Who knows?
We should point out, though, because this question has come up a number of times when we've given this presentation, that although autonomous technology may allow for a more comfortable commute or trip from one point to another, what this does not do is add hours to the day. So time is still at a premium, and we've addressed concerns. There's been a lot of people concerned that this will really spur exurban development, into the hinterlands, and that could be of concern to a lot of the cities and towns you're from. But I do believe that just the overall constraint of time is the thing that prohibits that from ultimately happening.
We can definitely hope. The last part that we want to look at is more on the public side. So when you take a look at streets and you take a look at parking on streets, and this is Grandview Heights, which is it's a municipality just outside Columbus. It's actually, I think, surrounded by Columbus, if I'm not mistaken. But you have a typical urban development, on-street parking spaces, 8 or 9 foot lane, little or no on-street parking needed. What the big question is, what happens with all those areas? So potential areas to reclaim, you're looking at all of a sudden, if there's not on-street parking that's required, approximately 30-mile parking lanes, 8-foot lane widths could result in, just within this one city, an additional 1.3 million square feet that you have to deal with. Now, my guess is municipalities and cities aren't really going to want to repave those roads if they're not being fully used. The standard size for our streets accommodating parking is going to be in upwards more than 30 feet. Why would you provide paving if you only need the 22 feet required to have 2 cars pass each other? So we have to start thinking right now about how we can actually reorient some of those areas. And a lot of I think this is going to be in the realm of planning and landscape architecture, but there's opportunities to address some of the things that we're struggling with right now in urban areas, such as stormwater runoff. If you have that much land, all of a sudden you can now turn into a rain garden or a bioswale and try and reuse that to something a little more productive. You could, again, this is really us asking the question and kind of turning it over to the broader community. How do we start to understand the reuse of some of these areas? And there's going to be a lot of them, and there's going to be some really big problems and hopefully opportunities coming up within the near future. So what should we be doing? What should planners really be doing? The first is to mainstream the discussion. I think this is going to be very, very helpful right now with Uber on the road in Pittsburgh and all of the press that this has gotten of late. We need to start setting policy objectives, and we need to start planning differently. When I say differently, I also mean more flexibly. So it might be the extent that now we have codes that lessen the amount of parking that's required for development or redevelopment, once certain market penetrations of autonomous vehicles reach the road. So, you might have certain areas within cities that you wouldn't even consider right now to have no parking requirements. Again, this is something that we need to start being flexible about and understanding that the future is coming quicker than we think. And when you start thinking big, this is going to be, I think, one of the defining features of our generation. I don't want to overemphasize that, but I think it'll be, to the extent that cars made the world that we are living in today, autonomous cars can start to change that to how we see fit and hopefully present a number of opportunities for a lot of the communities in and around Ohio.
I think it's a real win for traditional neighborhood development, which is synonymous with a lot of the communities that you all represent. The challenge with planning in the post-automobile age was we were always playing catch-up. This is an opportunity for all of us to get out in front of it and be proactive rather than reactive, because we see the results of being reactive over a 70-year period, and much of it is not worth saving.
So on that note, I think that was a really good sum up, Rick. We're going to start taking some questions. So the way we have it set up is, Pearl, you'll ask the question from the audience, and I think we'll go ahead and restate it so everybody can hear, and then hopefully we can come up with some good answers, some good dialogue at least. So I'm unfamiliar with how this operation works, but I assume that there is some sort of tab on the webinar button that allows them a question box. Okay. Are there any other instructions that I need to
just type your message into the question box?
Type your message into the question box, and we'll answer it. No questions so far? So I just want to remind everybody that the World Series is tonight, and definitely we'll have to watch that.
That's actually where our other partner is.
Yeah, he was there last night, and I'm not coming back.
It's like no questions.
No questions.
We can talk about everything.
Usually there's some naysayers and some arguments, and we'd be more than happy to engage in those. It's one of my favorite parts is the questions.
You're always free to throw us a question after the fact. I believe our emails were on the presentation.
I think so.
And if they weren't, then
I'll forward them all to you.
I'm sure the good folks at Heritage Ohio will forward them on.
All right, we have a question.
Oh, we do have a question.
You mentioned the elimination of a need for parking as a result of automated cars. Has there been a consideration of where these cars will stand when they're not being used or cannot return to their home port?
That's a very, very good question. If you're looking at something that has an enormous scale, a very dense city like New York, yeah, you're going to have some issues with that. The nice part about it is these cars being able to drive themselves, they can basically hone into wherever they need to go to charge. So the way in a world 30, 40 years down the line, you might have fully autonomous fleets of cars that know exactly when they need to get charged, where they go, how the whole operation works, and is optimized in the sense that they're fully aware of where they need to go and where they need to get charged. Now, I mentioned garages. That could be a potential for garages in terms of car storage for charging. I think that would be a pretty beneficial reuse for something like that, where you could have basically a hive that's in a dense district that all the cars orient towards and charge themselves and go about their day after that.
Yeah, so, the question was, where do cars go if we've reduced all the parking requirements? And so I think the answer is different in urban versus suburban versus rural communities. In urban, I agree with Justin. I can see cars being summoned to existing garages to be charged while they're waiting, and then also I can see these cars being deployed at optimal usage times to anticipate demand. In suburban environments, we've kicked around a bunch of interesting ideas, like maybe my driveway is used as a charging base, and I receive a discount for using a service by allowing my driveway to be used as a charging base. It's an interesting reuse of a driveway if you don't need your driveway, or if you don't need as much of a driveway anymore. Maybe your garage is a charging base.
Yeah. The other thing to think about is there could just be the potential for a lot less cars out there. We've seen numbers that every fully autonomous car that's used as a service can replace, I think, 4 to 7 actual owned cars. So we're talking about just a lot less vehicles that would be within an urban area.
I have another question.
Okay, another question.
What happens to transit-oriented development and fixed asset mass transit systems?
There's a couple things that we've kind of foreseen. I'll start with the transit piece first. If you have a fixed asset transit system, so let's say rail, subway, those are incredibly efficient. We don't see this necessarily being in direct competition with a system like that. When it comes to Columbus and when it comes to a lot of the other areas within Ohio, most of our cities don't have extraordinarily robust transportation systems. My guess is that this would compete really, really heavily with systems like CODA, with buses. Maybe not even compete, that might even be the wrong word, but if you can picture a hybrid system where CODA might fund some of the trips for folks, or they have their own model of bus that goes around but just becomes a lot more rapid than our current situation.
Well, it's also easy to imagine that existing transportation authorities will get much better. They'll have a lot more options at their disposal. They should have more resources at their disposal. The existing routes and buses, there's a tremendous amount of expense in the current system. And if you can deploy a more nimble system that's more that anticipates demand and more reactive to users, and not necessarily, I'm not advocating for the removal of bus stops, but what if you add fixed asset bus stops in conjunction with actually taking you to your doorstep?
Yeah.
These are things that you can imagine.
Providing last mile transportation between those fixed assets. And the other option too is it might make things like intercity rail a lot more reasonable, because once you get off in Columbus, there's going to be a very good expectation that there's going to be a robust system that can take you where you ultimately need to go once you get out of that station. Excuse me.
All right, we have another question about the level fare of cars. How long do you think that everyone will continue to have non-autonomous off-the-road vehicles?
Well, let me take that one. So I think cars, traditional cars as we know them, they are not going to go by the way of the dinosaur. They will be around, but there will be less and less of them. And I think this is driven by a number of things, one of which is a significant one is the generational divide. The generation that is most infatuated with their cars are, frankly, they're baby boomers. It's the older generation. And, the ones that are least fascinated with cars are, millennials and younger. I've got kids that are approaching driving age. They've never even talked about getting their driver's license. Some of my children's friends are already driving, and it is not a big deal. It just simply is not as big a deal as when 20, 25 years ago when we were getting our licenses. I also think liability is ultimately going to be the thing that really drives it home. And what I mean by that is when I get into my car after this presentation is over, I'm liable for anything that happens in that car. Google has already publicly stated that they want 100% liability to be on them if you get into an automated Google car. So that means you get in there and it's in an accident, you are not financially liable for any of that. I believe that will ultimately be the thing that drives this in even faster towards a high rate of adoption. But
I like to liken it to horses. Horses were a primary mode of transportation for a very long time. And the second somebody saw a guy driving on the street with a Model T, they sent their horse to the glue factory and went to the dealership and bought themselves a car. People still have horses today. It's people in rural areas. It's folks who do it for recreation, people who do it for sport. And I really don't see cars being that much different. I think that, there's still going to be a place for them. I think they'll still be around. But, as time goes on and the technology or the machines get older and older and older, it might be a little more expensive to maintain. And eventually it's going to be something that makes financial sense as well as a liability sense, which I agree with you with. Any more questions? No more questions. Well, I just want to say that it's been a pleasure to be able to speak to all of you and answer some of the questions. And I know Rick and I are both available. If anybody else has further questions, I can be reached basically through Heritage Ohio. Joe can forward any questions on, as well as Pearl, and we'd be more than happy to talk any further. Thank you.
I'd like to thank everyone for attending the webinar today. For our calendar of upcoming events, including our future webinars, please visit us at heritageohio.org.
How did you get it down here?